we're going to go ahead and start fielding questions from the audience at this point. The first question we have is, can you talk about the distinction between hydraulic fracturing, wastewater disposal, as they relate to induced seismicity?
This is Bill Ellsworth. I could take that question. That's really a good one, and there's a lot of confusion regarding this issue. So let me see if I can help clarify this. Hydraulic fracturing is a process that is used to improve the flow of either oil or gas to the production well, and it is a brief pressurization of the well, which causes many tiny earthquakes we call micro-earthquakes, then introduce new fractures into the rock that allow the oil or the gas to flow to the well. It's a process which has been used maybe more than 1 million times in the United States, and as far as I know, no earthquakes as large as magnitude 4 have ever been associated with the process. So while it has some hazard associated with it, we think it's very small. It's also a very brief process. It may last for a day or two at a particular well, and after the operation, the hazard goes away. Wastewater disposal, on the other hand, as both Rex and Austin explained, is something that can go over periods of many years and often involves very, very large volumes of fluid going underground. Although the pressure rise during in the disposal process may not be very large, it can be enough to induce favorably oriented faults to slip if the stresses are high enough. And in these areas that both Rex and Austin described, we've seen that the empirical evidence suggests that these pressure fronts actually move quite a distance away from the wells, such as we know occurred both at the Denver Rocky Mountain situation and at the Rangeley experiment.
Great, thanks, Bill. We've got a couple other questions. One is, how deep are the faults that are causing earthquakes?
I can handle that for Oklahoma. So, and actually this is true in a lot of these cases of triggered seismicity. Most of the faults that are slipping and having earthquakes are within the crystalline basement and generally below the injection zone that's the water is being injected into.
Great. There's another follow-on actually to that, also asking about, can the injection of fluid ever create a new fault, or is induced seismicity always associated with a dormant ancient fault?
Well, certainly in the case of hydraulic fracturing, a new fault can be formed if the pressures are high enough. We of course don't know where all of the ancient faults are, but in cases where we have, through industry cooperation, been able to look at seismic images, it's been possible in many of these cases to identify the place where the earthquakes were occurring with a pre-existing fault. So our understanding is that the majority of these induced earthquakes are in fact occurring on ancient faults. And it's really only those ancient faults that are well oriented in today's stress field. So this is why the work that Austin was describing is so important, to not only understand where the faults may be located, but also what the orientation of the stresses are. Because some faults will be capable of slipping and others will not. And it's really important to identify those that are going to be most hazardous because they're well oriented.
This is Rex, and yeah, just to sort of bring again our perspective on this, I would agree with everything everybody said, and I think everything that we've seen these have all been basement faults, pre-existing faults, but we struggle to know the locate. There are an awful lot of faults out there that we don't know the locations of, and we're working sort of the same way the folks in Oklahoma are to identify those. And I would also, just to add back to the first question, I don't think that we've seen any felt earthquakes in Kansas that we can associate with hydraulic fracturing at this point.
If I could add one other thing to what Rex said, he made a very important point here, which is that we don't know where many of these faults are, and the way we'll find out about them is that they'll begin to produce earthquakes. So one of the keys to managing the hazard may be to identify the smallest earthquakes when they begin to occur, which is really the heads up that something larger may happen. And as we've seen both in Oklahoma and in Kansas, the ability to locate small earthquakes is very much controlled by the number of stations, which is less than adequate for the job in many of these areas.
That's a really good point, Bill, and that's part of the reason we're trying to get out into some of these surrounding counties and beginning to get some sort of baseline data before we see a lot of big disposal wells in those areas, so we'll have some sense of what's going on in terms of smaller earthquake activity.
And this question is more for Rex and Austin. Is the information regularly being shared with the state emergency management agencies, earthquake program managers also?
Austin, I'll go ahead and then I'll let you answer that. From our perspective, I've talked to our emergency preparedness a couple of times on the state level. I think I can safely say the level of interest is much higher in Kansas on the local level than it is on the statewide level. And on the local level, particularly in Harper County, the county that's seen the most of this, we talk to those folks fairly regularly. In fact, I've got a conference call with their head of emergency management just this afternoon because, again, when you come from a relatively quiet state the way we do, we don't do earthquake drills. Our building codes are still sort of taking all this stuff into account. So we're playing a little bit of a game of catch-up and trying to communicate between the folks on the science policy side and the emergency management side is real important. So that's a good question. And I can say in our world, the focus has really been on the local level, much less on the state level.
So here in Oklahoma, the greatest rates of seismicity began picking up in 2009 and really kicked up in 2010, just east of Oklahoma City, just outside the state capital. And so we've been interacting with the Oklahoma Office of Emergency Management since 2010. We've been creating educational information and keeping them informed. And of course, earthquakes were always on their radar, but still tornadoes are the greatest risk and challenge for their management system in the ice storms we experience. So they're clearly aware of the hazard and are preparing for it, educating the public and working with us. And so we've long had that cooperation with the Oklahoma Office of Emergency Management.
Austin, your point's a good one. I can tell you the folks, especially this time of year in this part of the world, worry as much or more about tornadoes than they do about earthquakes.
Rex, I've got a question here for you about the KCC. And do you know how the KCC determine the levels of volume reduction?
That's probably a better question for them than it is for me. I think they, in the course of making those decisions, I think they started off by looking at levels that were really what we would call levels that you would see in disposal wells in pre-earthquake days. That is, before we really started seeing a lot of horizontal drilling, a lot of the high volume wells might be 5,000 barrels a day. That was what wells did back in pre-earthquake days. So I think they started looking at that, but I think they also were trying to come up with levels that would allow the companies to adjust accordingly over time, and as a result came up with numbers that are somewhat higher than that. But exactly how they arrived at that step-by-step cutback is probably more of a question for them than it is for me.
Great, thanks. And then we've got one question here about, are the current seismic networks across the central and eastern United States capable of detecting the smaller predecessor earthquakes that you mentioned?
Unfortunately not. The seismic monitoring in the eastern part of the United States, up a little bit past the Mississippi River going west, have been improved significantly by at least the temporary addition of seismic stations on a grid pattern. And that's certainly going to help with general detection there. But our experience, particularly with special studies such as those that we've discussed here in Oklahoma and Kansas, suggests that we'd really like to be reliably locating, not only detecting, but precisely locating earthquakes down to about magnitude 1 or so. And that will require more stations than we have currently. Certainly, the OGS and the KGS are doing the best job they can with the research, with the resources that they have, and working together with the USGS, we're doing what we can to improve the monitoring, but we're not really where scientifically we would like to be.
I would like to add one thing to that. So the Oklahoma Geological Survey has operated a network since 1978. We've roughly been able to detect most magnitude 2 or larger earthquakes. And so we've been adding to our network consistently since 2010. And we have another 5 permanent stations or 6 permanent stations to distribute throughout the state. However, this won't get us much below this magnitude 2 sort of detection threshold statewide. There'll be areas where, of course, we can do much better than that. But what it does do is allow us to say a lot more about the magnitude 2 earthquakes we're locating. And to get down to that magnitude 1 range, it requires very dense instrumentation. And that's a big expense. And the state at this point is not able to take that monitoring effort on. But we've been doing a lot to enhance our monitoring and are well positioned to continue monitoring. However, we're having so many earthquakes that it's a real challenge just to keep up with the seismicity within the state.
Thanks. Another question is, it's about the seismic data. One of our participants is wondering, is that seismic data available in real time to the public?
Well, certainly all of the U.S. Geological Survey data is available in real time through our website, and much of the data from these other collaborating networks is as well. I'll let Austin answer about availability in Oklahoma, which I know is quite good as well.
Absolutely. We make a real point to make sure that all our data is publicly available and available to researchers. That's a big part of what we do, especially since our time is so limited. It's important to have researchers from around the country and around the world being able to use this data.
Yeah, and this is Rex, and I would actually say we're probably a little behind the curve on that, since we really just got the temporary stations that we put in installed over the last matter of weeks. In fact, we're getting ready to move one of them again. We will get to where Oklahoma and the USGS are, but we're not there yet. We're still sort of getting stable in terms of getting this network established.
We've just got time for one last question here today, and that would be, what's the basis for developing the trigger benchmarks that could lead to reduction or ceasing injection, and how involved are the various stakeholders such as seismologists, regulators, industry in that?
Austin, I'll go ahead and answer for Kansas. If you look at that action plan that I put the URL up, you can see sort of the various components that went into that. That was a formula that was developed by folks at the Geological Survey, the KCC, and Kansas Department of Health and Environment. But we opened that up for comment from the public, and we got input from a variety of industry people, the general public as well. We went back and revised it somewhat, got another round of input from them. We then actually made an adjustment on the scoring in January because it wasn't always turning up exactly what we were after. That formula actually did not get triggered by the 4.9 earthquake, just because it was a single event kind of off by itself. We knew sort of intuitively we really want a 4.9 earthquake to trigger looking for disposal wells. So we've gone back and tinkered with that formula and revised it in January.
The levels in Oklahoma are established by the Corporation Commission. Of course, I try to help explain the seismicity and what we can say about the seismicity and the uncertainties associated with what we know. And it's been an evolving sort of trigger level for the Corporation Commission, and they've changed how far out they buffer. They started at like a 2-mile buffer and then a 3-mile buffer, and now we're at a 6-mile buffer. So it's sort of an evolving process as we move forward. And certainly the science helps inform this, and that's why it's important to get the peer-reviewed science out there and the science to help inform regulator actions and decisions.
Great, thank you. Well, that's all the time we have today for our question and answer session. If you have any questions that weren't addressed today, you can email them to us at cipinfo@americangeosciences.org, and we'll make sure to send your questions along to the speakers. So thank you again very much to Bill, Rex, and Austin for speaking today. And this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, everyone.